Okay, once more into the breach. Let's see. So meditation number 4, concerning the true and the false. So Descartes begins with certain knowledge that he experiences within himself his faculty of judgment. Okay. No doubt that we form judgments. We're pretty familiar with that and comfortable with that by this point in the course. And if you form judgments, you have the power to form judgments, so you have a faculty of judgment. Okay. So Descartes adds that God made him, because now he thinks that God exists, right? He thinks he's proved God exists. As you can see, guys, I'm not much of a Cartesian, right? I've been criticizing him all the way through, but that's fine. You're welcome to try to rebut those criticisms and set up Cartesianism as the true philosophy. So he adds that God made him in his faculty, and that since God is not a deceiver, he can be certain that the faculty, if properly employed, will not in virtue of its own operation cause him to err. What's the reasoning there? He's proved that God exists, God is perfect, so he's good, and he made me. Well, let me back up. He's good, he's not a deceiver, he did make me, and he gave me the faculty of judgment, so he didn't give me a faculty which is rigged from the get to err. If I use it well, I can make progress in knowing truth. Okay. So the problem now is to determine with certainty how to use it properly. So now this is the question of method. How do you use your judgment correctly? Okay, your faculty of judgment. So he takes the indirect approach to this, asks the question, what is the source of error, right? I can proceed via negation. If I can just avoid that which causes error, all that will be left for me is to affirm truth, right? So he offers us this argument. If error exists, it is produced by a finite and imperfect being and not by an infinite and perfect being. Premise number 2, error does exist. Conclusion, it is produced by a finite and imperfect, not an infinite and perfect being. Okay, that seems straightforward enough that doesn't require comment. Next argument. Premise 1, if I err, then it is in virtue of being finite and imperfect. I do err, and therefore I am finite and imperfect. Okay, very good. So this is not terribly difficult to grasp either. He's finite and imperfect. This is obvious, right? You're finite. You can't see behind your head. You have to stop at some point and eat, right? You're limited, and you need various sorts of things to keep you in existence and to enable you to sense and think and so on. Now, why would God make a faculty that can err? Okay, it's like a theological question. That's interesting. He's asking a theological question, but he's going to try to answer that with purely philosophical resources. Let's see how well he does. So I call this slide the rejection to final causation. Premise number 1, if God is perfect, then there are many things that he makes, the purpose for which I cannot know. Okay? Premise 2, God is perfect. Therefore, there are many things that he makes, the purpose for which I cannot know. Okay, I think Aquinas could say that too. You know, there are things that God wills, and God doesn't. You know, that belongs to the mystery of the divinity. There are certain things that we can't understand because we can't penetrate into the divine mind. Okay, very good. Premise number 3: if there are many created purposes that I cannot know, then it would be rash to assume that in a given case that can be doubted that I know its purpose. For example, with respect to mineral, vegetable, animal, and celestial nature. Okay, so look where he's going there. All right, so if there's, we know that there are cases where God's purposes cannot be known, and therefore, with respect to the other cases where I think I know those purposes, I shouldn't be so rash, right? Let me back off for a moment. So from this, he derives 3 conclusions, 3 more conclusions, rather. First, it would be epistemically rash to judge that I know the purpose of various kinds of natural being. Next conclusion. If that's true, then the Aristotelian category of final cause is theoretically useless. Okay, see how aggressively he's pushing this. And then C4, therefore teleological physics can never be justified. Remember his letter to Marsan, which I mentioned 2 lectures ago. That, don't tell anybody, but actually my meditations contains all the principles of my physics, and I'm hoping that the Jesuits get used to this get used to my principles before they noticed what has happened. This is like a revolution by osmosis. They'll study his book. Now, is this really going to work? You know, I mean, the Jesuits weren't a group of idiots. These were highly educated people, and they could see exactly what's going on, right? They're at least as well equipped as I am, at least. Okay, and I've noticed all sorts of problems with Descartes' argument so far, and we know historically they noticed them too. And I already gave you a whole laundry list of sort of run-ins with the law that he had back then. So note that he does not regard it as epistemically rash to presume that one can discover God's hidden mathematical design for the natural world. Okay, because that's where he's going to end up. He thinks that he can actually, through a priori reasoning, uncover this kind of perfect mathematical set of principles behind reality. That's not epistemically rash. Okay. So next, what about, you know, mommy and daddy giraffe produce a baby giraffe. At first, it's just a clump of cells, and then it starts developing within the womb of mommy giraffe, and then it eventually looks like a giraffe, right? And then mommy giraffe gives birth to the baby giraffe, which is pretty, from our point of view, it's a pretty formidable animal in and of itself. Comes right out of mommy giraffe. It stands up immediately, if I remember what I saw in the nature special, and starts moving around. And according to Descartes, that the act of generation, procreation on the part of mommy and daddy giraffe, did not occur for the sake of producing another giraffe. That seems, hard to swallow, actually, because they did perform the act of procreation. Look what happened. What did they do? Did they generate a sea manatee? I mean, what happened? Did they somehow produce a hippopotamus? It was another giraffe, right? The whole thing seems to embody, in a very obvious way, that doesn't require much thought, a certain teleology, and that there is a finality and orientation towards the end of there being a giraffe in that whole thing. He thinks that if we can't know all of God's purposes, then we can't know any of them. All right. So, perfection, imperfection, and error. Descartes refers to the question concerning why God would permit error. The answer, what appears imperfect, taken by itself, may fit into a larger whole that is itself perfect. Perfect after its kind again, right? Something very important has occurred here. Descartes has introduced a rigorously non-teleological concept of perfection, right? Because now that he's rejected the idea of teleology, and he keeps using this word of perfection, we have to now think about this in a non-teleological way. I mean, this is a total revolution in thought. Okay, so I put it here in the lecture. This is a wholly new chapter in the history of metaphysics. To anticipate a later result, Descartes will offer us a mathematical concept of perfection. The world is perfect insofar as it perfectly obeys, without exception, mathematical laws. So the idea is that mathematics is perfect, right? And then a reality that's structured in its very essence in accordance with mathematical laws, it, as it were, inherits the perfection of mathematics. But it is unclear how mathematical perfection might entail the necessity of error. How does that fit in? Okay. Note that Copernicus was free to accept both mathematical and teleological perfection. We saw that earlier. Descartes did not write after its kind, which strictly leaves open the possibility that the universe and God... Oh, look at this. This leaves open the possibility that the universe and God are actually the same thing. And I'm going to anticipate, I'll point out to you later in Meditation 6, he actually invokes this idea, that the order of nature is God's creature or is God himself. All right, no devout Jew, Christian, or Muslim would say that the order of nature is God himself. Okay? Well, I could say that it exists in God. That's as close as you're going to get to that. And a lot of theologians and metaphysicians say that the cosmos exists in God in some way or another. Okay? but none of them will say that the order of nature and God are the same thing. That's pantheism. All right, that is theistic naturalism. You guys get that? That's theistic naturalism. So Descartes does play with the idea in book 6, and if he's playing with the idea, he told us he's advancing masked. He said that in his diary. He wasn't expecting people to get their hands on that diary and read that, but now we know. And it may be that, in fact, he was a theistic naturalist, right? He upheld theistic naturalism. His successor and student, not official student, but the person who read his books and wrote about him, Benedict Spinoza, he very definitely upheld theistic naturalism. Okay, so introspection reveals that error depends upon two concurrent causes, the faculty of knowing and the faculty of willing. So you have to have two faculties operating in a cooperative way, and if you don't use them, if they don't cooperate in the right way, then you can produce an error. So the faculty of knowing concerns perceiving what is entertained by consciousness, I'll call it that, by the mind. The faculty of willing, when applied to the objects of the intellect, is capable of judging that the content is true or that it is false. Okay, so your intellect will then grasp a content, and then your will affirm or deny. Okay, so I mean, there's still some ambiguity here. Let's just proceed. I'll try to disambiguate things for you. So error occurs when the will judges a proposition to be true, when the intellect does not yet have a clear and distinct perception of the content, and the connection being entertained does not hold in reality. For example, as in all squares have an equal area to the cube of one of its sides. Okay, to perceive a content is one thing. To judge it true or false is another. Okay, so that statement, all squares have an area equal to the cube of one of its sides, is false, right? So if one affirmed that, one would be in error. It has an area equal to the square of one of its sides. Okay, so the primacy and infinitude of the will. So strictly for Descartes, there is no intellectual affirmation of the truth. The intellect doesn't do it, but only a clear and distinct perception of the content of a proposition. Truth or falsity is predicated of that proposition with warrant when the intellect's perception is clear and distinct. And when it satisfies these conditions, its perception is of something true. Okay. So, I mean, this gets a little complicated. So we can perceive something with clarity and distinctness. In that case, we have intellectually perceived something true, and then we form a judgment and affirm that judgment, provided that judgment affirms what is the case, that itself is likewise true. But we should withhold judgment until we have a clear and distinct perception of that concerning which we are judging or making a judgment. So the intellect is finite in its power, but perhaps astonishingly, the will is infinite. So is that by which we most resemble God? Well, that's an interesting idea, actually, right? Our intellect's finite, but the will is infinite, so we resemble God most in that respect. Why? Because we can will anything. But presumably we can't know anything. Okay, well, at least we can attempt to will anything, right? Like I can attempt right now to will into existence a new universe. I wouldn't do that because it's kind of pointless. But you can do it if I wanted to. But my intellect is finite. Even if I face God and God gives me a vision of himself, that itself, it'll only be partial. I won't be able to grasp the whole of God because he's beyond a creature, right? Even the most powerful angel in the Catholic scheme, even St. Mary, who's like way beyond any angel, doesn't have an absolutely perfect apprehension of God, right? It just surpasses the apprehension of all other saints and angels combined. All right, so I see what he's saying there. The intellect is finite, even if it can be darned impressive in a particular case. So only as joined to a finite intellect is the will less efficacious than the divine will, which is joined to an infinite intellect. Well, that's interesting. What's he saying there? So if we can somehow bolster the intellect and get more true propositions under our belt, so to speak, then we'll make our will more efficacious. That sounds like the technological project of becoming masters and possessors of nature. I think that's what's really going on here. So the will is the power to affirm or deny, to pursue or to shun, and we perceive with certainty that we are determined to it by no external force. Okay, so you are free, is what he's saying. Descartes, in effect, is affirming that he enjoys a clear and distinct perception of his own freedom. Do you have a clear and distinct perception of your own freedom? Raise your right arm freely. Not because I'm forcing you, because I'm not there forcing you, am I? You can freely raise it up. Well, is it fair to say you have a clear and distinct perception that you're free? Maybe. All right, so try this experiment. Do another experiment about your freedom. Say premise number 1, all men are mortal. Premise number 2, Socrates is a man. Now stop. Don't draw any conclusion. Okay? Now, at a time of your choosing, draw the obvious conclusion. Done? Okay. Here's the question for you. Were you compelled to choose the time you chose? Is there any evidence to the effect you were compelled to choose? Could there be any evidence that you were compelled to choose? I don't know. But that's a further sort of thought experiment you can conduct. Not thought experiment, but experiment you can conduct to test the hypothesis that you're free. So he is likening acts of freedom to the immediate perception of red and the immediate experience of one's own existence, both of which cannot be doubted. To appear to be willing is in fact to be willing. Okay, that's his position. Now look at his example of error. The cause of error is neither the intellect nor the will taken by themselves. The intellect perceives what is true and good, but is limited in what it perceives. When it does so perceive, the will is inclined to affirm the true and will the good, but always freely, as inclination is not determination. But the will goes beyond the intellect to matters that are indifferent. For example, is there an infinite number of Fibonacci prime numbers? Okay, not really. We know there's an infinite number of prime numbers, but is there an infinite number of Fibonacci prime numbers? That's something else. So the will goes beyond the intellect to matters that are indifferent and either affirms or denies. So as far as this whole idea of being inclined to something without being forced to conclude it, I know at least 2 different people who claim to have met Jesus Christ. One of them rejected him, okay? And the second one said, that was definitely Jesus. You can't possibly doubt it. I knew him as well as I know my own mother as soon as I saw him. But she refuses to become Christian. So that's interesting. So you can, listen, that they believe that they have that experience. And so in having that experience, you might say each was inclined in virtue of that experience to become a Christian. One said no, and didn't even, he even rejected later that was an authentic. Well, he kind of was in contradiction with himself. He told me it was an authentic experience, and that he also dismissed it, which is kind of a strange thing to do if you really think that was real. And the second person, she said it was absolutely an authentic experience, but she basically refused the invitation to become a Christian, and then she arrived at a kind of alternative theology and claimed that Jesus was, though he's real, he's kind of like, from her point of view, not such as to make, obligate one to become a Christian. It's complicated. So, inclination is one thing, freedom is another. Those 2 people, right there, there's a pretty good example of 2 cases that would seem to emphasize or highlight the reality of the faculty of the will and of freedom. So let's look at Descartes' example. Whether the thinking nature which is in me is distinct from the corporeal nature or is the same thing. Let's see what this amounts to. He neglects to mention his own considered possibility, whether his corporeal nature is a mere appearance. And he suggests that it is possible that his mind is his body. All right, let's read that sentence again, because this can be a little bit difficult. So he wants to consider whether the thinking nature which is in me, so his intellect and will and faculty of imagination, right, that mind, which is in him, is distinct from the corporeal nature, or is the same thing? Okay, so now he's finally come around to that question that we had before, right? Because he seemed to, he jumped to the conclusion that he is essentially a thinking thing without having, considered the question whether or not his corporeality belongs to his essence or not. But he's turning to that now. All right, so I am in error whether I judge falsely or judge truly, but without sufficient warrant. Okay, well, that's interesting. So if you judge falsely, or even you by chance judge truly, you're still in error if you didn't have sufficient warrant for drawing your conclusion. So getting to the right conclusion for the wrong reasons, right, or with sloppy methodology, that itself is to be an error from his point of view. It doesn't make any difference if you got there, because you didn't get there for the right reasons. You just equally well could have gotten to the wrong conclusion, and you won't be able to teach anybody anything because someone will see through your sloppy methodology and won't be under obligation to accept your argument. Okay? And inherent in this incorrect use of the free will is the privation that is the very essence of error. Was that privation present in this operation insofar as the operation proceeds from me? Was the privation of using your judgment strictly in accordance with the quality of the evidence that has been presented? When it's presented with clarity and distinctness, and only then do you have warrant to affirm that the judgment in question is true, or that is false. Like, for example, if I judge that there is someone proposes that there's a pink elephant to my right, I can look to my right now, which I'm doing, and there's no pink elephant there. I have a clear and distinct apprehension of the fact there's no pink elephant there, and so I judge there is none, and I'm correct. And the clarity and the distinctness with which the reality to my right presents itself to me provides me with a sufficient ground and a warrant to deny that there is a pink elephant there. All right. So you see, doesn't this stuff get a little bit, how can I put it? I mean, you have to start parsing things very, very closely in order just to talk about this stuff. So finally, God is not the cause of the privation of my act of will, which privation is a pure negation, a non-being, as God does not cause non-being. So God can't perform an action which is evil, nor cause evil. The idea that we saw originally in Plato and was affirmed by St. Thomas Aquinas. Protestants, by the way, just kind of classical Protestants, not contemporary Protestants. So classical Protestant following Calvin, they just bite the bullet and say that God causes everything, including what we call evil, which is a very difficult position to defend, but that's what they do. But God could have made me more perfect by either, number one, endowing me with an intellect that clearly and distinctly perceives all that it entertains, right? Then you'd always have a warrant for what you affirm and deny. Or two, by clearly impressing upon my mind the following rule: I should never judge anything that I do not clearly and distinctly understand. God hasn't done that either. So it's sort of like he's complaining. So is he blaming God? No, as his imperfection may fit into a larger perfection. This is his answer here. For example, God may have created Descartes imperfect because doing so was a necessary consequence of the general imperfection of the species that was brought about by the first human beings. Okay, so I go into some theology there. I think we can skip that. I thought I had changed the line of reasoning there, but the basic idea is that God, theological consideration is that God may have allowed our species to fall because then, through struggling against sin, and by suffering with dignity and offering that suffering up to God, one increases in virtue and in merit, and therefore with justice God can give one even greater joy than one would merit had he simply made one faultless and one had remained in that holy and faultless state. You guys follow? So, but he doesn't consider that. But anyway, that would kind of fit in, that his own imperfection and your imperfection and my imperfection and the imperfection of every member of our species fits into that larger kind of theological pattern. So that's part of how he could have thought about things. So let's look at the ontological argument for God's existence. By the way, those kinds of theological considerations, they don't occur anywhere in Descartes' writings, and it seems that he was not interested in them. So his encounter with Thomism seems to have been a negative one. It seems to me he had a bad teacher. Just, whoever his professor was just kind of left him a little bit cold. He obviously is fascinated with mathematics. He likes the idea of having more power over nature so as to satisfy one's desires. And who knows why that's the case. Okay, I believe at some point he has an illegitimate kid, and maybe he was wrestling with sexual desire, and that kind of that straight away will pull one away from Christianity, which argues or demands that one regulate the passions, particularly the sexual passion. Not absolutely, one could go and have 12 kids, but not gratify it outside of marriage and so on. Okay, so now let's look at his ontological argument for God's existence. Sorry, I have a mosquito trying to get me. Premise number 1: for any being that can be imagined, whatever can be clearly and distinctly perceived concerning it does in fact belong to it. Premise number 2: one clearly and distinctly perceives that being as such belongs to the very existence of God. He's onto something there, isn't he? I mean, if God exists at all, then he exists in virtue of this concept of being. He exists insofar as being itself belongs to him, or insofar as he's identical with being. Okay. Therefore, being does not belong. Therefore, being does belong necessarily to God, and therefore necessarily God exists. Comment: his argument turns on the premise that one is obligated to believe that which holds with necessity. Okay, let's look at that idea. It holds with necessity that God contains the perfection of existence. Okay, this does not comport with his rejection of the final cause very well, but let's just let that go. Therefore, one ought to believe that God exists, and it is pointless to attempt to distinguish between what one believes to be the case and what is the case, as what one ought to believe is what logic and the meanings of terms constrain one to believe. Okay, so one has these beliefs. Logic, as a matter of fact, requires that one draw a certain conclusion, and that's it. You have to conclude that God exists with necessity. So objection: one can avoid this conclusion by reformulating the definition of God in the form of a conditional. This is how followers of St. Thomas Aquinas reject this argument. They say, if God exists, it's a big if, then he exists in accordance with necessary non-contingent existence. And so the Cartesian doesn't just roll over, right? So he has a rebuttal. It says the conditional itself presupposes that the concept of God involves that of necessary existence. So one is in fact obligated to believe that God exists. Okay, then you go into philosophy journals where people will argue this back and forth. Some say that the whole idea of an a priori deductive argument for the existence of God just doesn't work. Other persons say, no, they do work. The a posteriori deductive arguments work too. Other persons say, no, only a priori deductive arguments work, and the a posteriori Thomist deductive arguments don't work, and so on. And there's an endless amount that's been published in this area, if you're interested. So let's talk about the famous Cartesian circle. This is a bad thing, okay? This is what most philosophers, independently of everything that I've said, acknowledge as a big problem in Descartes. Descartes rests everything on the criteria of clarity and distinctness, right? He's very, very clear about that. How do we know that these criteria are themselves reliable? Okay, that's the big question. It's sort of the $100,000 question here, okay? We seem to have clear and distinct perceptions of mathematical truths, but we have found a reason to call even these into doubt. So we must look for a guarantee of these criteria. God exists. He is not a deceiver, and he has created us to affirm that which we clearly and distinctly believe to be true, or perceive to be true. Therefore, we can be sure that when we do enjoy a clear and distinct perception of truth, the matter is indeed true. Here's the problem. But Descartes, in fact, had to rely upon clarity and distinctness as criteria in the process of proving that God exists. So he cannot later appeal to God in order to secure the epistemic reliability of the criteria of clarity and distinctness. Okay, so how do we know God exists? Because we have a clear and distinct apprehension of the propositions which link together prove that God exists. Okay, that's how we know that God exists. But how do we know that that clarity and distinctness with which we apprehended those propositions, how do we know that that clarity and distinctness are sufficient, right, for us to get to the conclusion that God exists and to know that it's true? Well, it's because God exists and he's not a deceiver, and he made us such as to be in need of clear and distinct apprehensions of reality in order to know anything at all. Well, that's a circle, okay? So we need clarity and distinctness to get to God. We need God in order to guarantee the epistemic reliability of clarity and distinctness. That's the Cartesian circle. And for, I'd say the majority of philosophers who read Descartes, they think this is a definitive refutation of Cartesianism, okay? Now, you can search far and wide nowadays. You're not going to find many Cartesians. It's a system that has been endlessly suggestive for modern philosophers in a way. In a certain sense, everybody's a Cartesian because in modern philosophy, I think the Thomists try to get out of this, but in modern philosophy, like if you reject Thomism and Aristotelianism, okay, and you're somewhere in the area of modern philosophy, then you are responding to Cartesianism one way or another. And you're trying to, without going backwards, go forward and solve the problems he bequeathed to us. All right? But as far as adhering to the strict letter of his doctrine, I can't even name a single Cartesian in philosophy departments. Whereas there are a whole bunch of Thomists. There are a bunch over at Providence College. Okay. And in the theology department. So here's another proof of the existence of God. Let's see if this one works. The present moment is finite and bounded by the future. It is defined against the future, and far from implying the existence of the future, the present implies the non-existence of the future, right? Because it's the present moment, and it excludes the existence of the future moment. You guys get that? Because it is the present moment. It's not the future moment, which does not exist, right? So that seems to be true, that first premise. Nonetheless, the future that a moment ago was, now is, right? So the future that a moment ago was the future a moment ago now exists in the present, okay? There we go. Therefore, conclusion, there must be something outside of the present cosmos that causes the future to exist, because it's not going to come from the present, which actually excludes the future in virtue of its being present. And only God could possess the power to make an entire cosmos at a given moment of time. Therefore, God exists. And now this also undergirds the thesis that God is engaged in the act of creating each moment of time in our universe. And though his act of creation is from eternity, each moment is a product of that act of creation. So there's a kind of sloppy way of referring to this as continuous creation. Well, no, God is not continuously creating because he's outside of time, right? But each moment is created just as much as every previous moment. The alternative to that is to say that God created the universe at the first moment in which it came to existence, and then he merely conserves it after that. There's creation followed by conservation, and what Descartes is effectively, whether he wants to acknowledge it or not, is committed to is the idea that every moment is created as much as every other moment. Each moment is as created as every other moment. Okay, so one can say this in objection: the present moment, in fact, continuously passes into the future. Right? We can't even conceive of the present moment as absolutely excluding the future, because what it is to be a present moment is to pass into the future, right? Or to put it the other way around, what it is to be the present moment is to pass in the past and be replaced by the future. But that's what it is to be the present moment, right? Okay, so the present moment leaves a comet tail behind it extending into the past. Does that make any sense? Right, so the present moment exists and it vanishes, and there's like, even right now, this present moment, there's a comet tail of pastness about it, right? The past is not utterly past. There's like a little trace of the past attached to the present moment. And there's another trace. The trace is the right word. There's a kind of a lisping anticipation of the future in the present moment. Make any sense, guys? It's the second time we're thinking about time more seriously. There's maybe the case the present does have the attribute of expansion, in contradiction to what St. Augustine said, and that two features of its expansion are that it leaves a kind of comet tail behind it, and also is characterized by a lisping sort of anticipation of the future that will enter and replace it. Okay. So the present has the property of expansion again, right? Okay, so I already said that. Now, let me see here. Sixth meditation. We're almost done here, guys. Why are those so small? I don't get that, but here we go. Here he draws all of his metaphysical conclusions. Thus far, he has concluded the following. Number one, I exist. Number two, if an external world exists, then its essence is extendedness, right? That's a conditional. Number three, God exists. Number four, God is not a deceiver. Number five, if an external world exists, then we cannot know any final causes that might exist in it. Number six, clarity and distinctness are perfectly reliable criteria of truth. Number seven, if I have a clear and distinct perception of a connection, that I should affirm it with an act of the will. If not, not. So number seven is your methodological principle. Number eight, God has made me such as to be strongly inclined to affirm that which I clearly and distinctly perceive. So now he has the following. Number nine, I have such a strong and vivid experience of an external world that I am ineluctably, means with necessity, inclined to affirm its existence. Number 10, God made me such as to believe in accordance with 9. Number 11, therefore the external world exists. So if you bring number 11 back in contact with 1 and 3, you have three principal results of Descartes' argument. Number 1, I exist. Number 3, or number 2, God exists. Number 11, or number 3, therefore the external world exists. Okay? 1, 2, 3. If the external world exists, other people exist too. So we can say that you exist, and groups of people exist, and nations exist, and so on. Your family exists. So summary and conclusion. Minds exist as thinking, immaterial, unextended substances. God exists, and he is perfectly good, wise, and powerful. It can be clearly and distinctly perceived that material reality exists as extended substance, and thus is endowed with number, shape, and motion. Okay, the stuff he's interested in. Next, the fundamental principles of teleological physics cannot be clearly and distinctly perceived, and therefore, in sum, Descartes has constructed a metaphysical system providing a foundation for a new mechanistic philosophy of nature and a new civilizational program dedicated to discovering and exploiting its mechanisms for the sake of human comfort, longevity, and power. All right. Okay, so let that roll about the tongue a bit, reflect on it, and I look forward to hearing your replies. Be well.